cyborg investigates a mastermind hacker, but will it lead to answers to her own past? That's, of course, the story of Ghost in the Shell. We'll be talking about the 1995 version and the 2017 live action with starring Scarlett Johansson. I'm John Chang Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
And something that we've talked about before, how can some of these kind of franchises or properties successfully transition from one media to another? Like I think sometimes, like we've seen like just some mixed results with, of course, Stephen King going from, the printed page to on screen. But then, meanwhile, you have things like, of course, Walking Dead or even Game of Thrones that, really kind of, until of course the last season, to achieve, some pretty outstanding success as well.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in the case of sort of manga and anime, half the job's done for you. Your storyboard is already there. You have the sort of visual element. I think it's the difficulty that you have with any kind of animated or basically comic book adaptation is that half of the artwork is done, or animation is done, because it would be too expensive to do in as a live action production anyway. So, and if it's just sort of a manga or a comic, then you've got also the audience's imagination filling in a lot of the gaps as well. So there's definitely challenges, but it can't be as hard as adapting a novel where someone has a half an hour inner dialogue or something like that, which is almost impossible to transfer to film. I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
I think you hit on something where going from manga to anime is not as big of a leap, I think, as going from anime to live action, because of, like you said, just the practicalities of the visuals and stuff. I think the problem is that, like, and we'll certainly see that today, I think, is that sometimes you want to create such a rich environment that, like, the budget is, I don't know about a limit, but it definitely creates, kind of some interesting dynamics, because, like, certainly you have these big ambitions, but then, other times, if other elements don't quite line up, you can actually have, as we'll certainly talk about later, that a real dud, I guess, in financially, and then of course that will, like, really quell any hopes of future projects and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's also the question of time as well, in terms of how the media is written. I mean, in manga, obviously you can kind of take as much time as you like reading it. You're reading it frame by frame,
right?
And that's why an animated TV show is a much more natural kind of transition, in that at least you have a long period of time to sort of flesh out characters and explore some of the more interesting plot lines. Whereas a movie, you're very much confined. So I think it's almost more of a challenge to go from a sort of a manga to a 2-hour animated movie than it is to go from say a manga to a live action TV show. I think you could actually make that more transition better. But yeah, we will indeed see how it pans out with a live action movie later on.
So I guess
a movie,
I was going to say, I think with that, let's dive into the original movie version, 1995.
Yes. I remember seeing this in 1995, and I'd sort of got into anime and manga in the early 90s, and I'd seen sort of Akira and a few others, and Ghost in the Shell came along, and it was kind of one of those movies that you thought it would be much more of a kind of a standard action kind of adventure or something like this. And it turned out to be really quite sort of cerebral and philosophical. And the animation is really interesting, but I think it's a bit like how Minority Report was more interesting, not so much for the story itself, but more the collection of the ideas about the future. And that's really what really sort of hit home with me. It Goes to the Shell the first time I saw it.
Yeah, so this is actually my first time actually watching it. I've just, like, a lot of these, they've always been like on my consciousness, or just like on the edges of my periphery that like I was aware of them and like kind of like always meaning to watch that stuff. But like so many other things like differentizers always seem to be some other kind of, and certainly I feel like nowadays there's even more different things pulling at our attention and stuff.
Totally.
So.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was a very striking, the opening image of, this sort of robot cyborg that's being constructed in front of you and then sort of bathed in white liquid as it sort of comes out with all this sort of strange ethereal music is pretty amazing, I think. And I mean, I do think sort of Mamoru Oshii, who directs this, he does some pretty interesting anime. Things like Angel's Egg are really out there. It's almost like a David Lynch style sort of anime in a way, and it's very visually arresting, I would say.
Was it you that was kind of pointing out how like it really echoes of Westworld stuff, which we recently talked about? Yeah.
I mean, Westworld completely ripped that off, and it did actually get me thinking quite deeply about this idea of what is it? Why are they bathed in white? And then, of course, it goes back to this idea, I think, of them being like dolls, essentially. So, and that's actually expanded on in the sequel, where they actually have these kind of almost sort of sex robots that are dolls that then get sort of hacked. But in this one, it's this idea of, a doll is a bit like a computer. And I think it's a really clever analogy because for any kind of self-aware creature, building a doll is like creating your best attempt at a 3D representation of yourself. And a computer is really our best attempt at creating a representation of our mind. So a doll is like the physical body, the computer is like the mind. So having those sort of together as a visual kind of metaphor was really clever, I thought. And it goes back to this idea of, what I think the reason this is a distinctly Japanese one, because it sort of ties in with the idea of a geisha, or perhaps even kabuki. In that the idea of a geisha is that, they're wearing all this sort of white makeup and they're there to sort of entertain and perform, which is, it's somewhat, when you're in a sort of a performance or you're specifically acting, you're basically almost like a human doll that is putting their own personality to one side to sort of entertain using the personality. So in a way, it's kind of like you're becoming a living mannequin. And that was, I thought, something that's kind of ties in quite a lot with this idea of a sort of a robot that's inhabited by a human consciousness.
Right. And I guess, like it definitely is amplified where like, they actually have the, what's called the geisha robot and stuff. And it's kind of like an interesting kind of idea, like, whereas Westworld, we certainly got into, kind of the idea of, like I said, actual like sex doll kind of thing. So this one like kind of, still kind of has this restraint, I guess, if you will, or that it's not, at least it's not discussed that that's the use, I guess, of these, robots and stuff like that. And certainly like the other part of it is like it's the idea that it's still a person though, like kind of that's the ghost in the shell, that their spark, if you will, or their intelligence slash something like akin to a soul is still kind of injected into this shell.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, isn't it, that you can almost transfer. But I mean, from what I understood, and I was trying to pay attention to the technicalities of it, but I think it has she has a human brain, but in a kind of a robot body, was what I kind of gathered. So that's that's kind of interesting, this idea that the soul is existing in the brain, and is this sort of, and it's put forward as this sort of incorruptible humanity that's present in these things. But then, of course, it does get corrupted by kind of hacking and things like this, which is another interesting idea. Yeah.
The recent Amazon series actually gets a little bit into some of these questions, though. So I say that that's actually closer to this vision than Westworld, because Westworld's the idea of a artificial creation of intelligence and slash something that simulates humanity, but in Download, it's people after they die, they get uploaded, kind of
right.
Actually, I guess it's actually called Upworld. Like, I'm calling it Download, but it's actually so it's people getting uploaded into this kind of simulation of a world and stuff like that. They're trying to achieve Download, which is like kind of coming back to life and everything into like a body and everything like that. So that's like kind of one of the side challenges. It's a subplot, I guess. Of the series.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's this I think Ghost in the Shell was certainly the first sort of science fiction I'd seen where they'd had this idea of a human consciousness that existing in an artificial intelligence, or even human bodies that have been augmented in extensive ways to either improve or just sort of mend various bits of their bodies. And I think this in this sort of reality of future Tokyo, where human augmentation has become a point where it's really just, there's no moral question or any other objections to it. It's just purely functional, and that you have the sort of I don't know if it's the operator whose fingers just split apart, and then there's just lots of little tiny sort of robotic fingers, or the Batou's eyes and things like this, and just there really to augment
that. And also the way the city itself looks reminded me a lot of Blade Runner, just like kind of where Blade Runner, you had like kind of like these augments and stuff like that, but those were genetic and stuff, and then like just the kind of the wet, grimy kind of look to things and stuff. It's funny because like a lot of the characters were I guess kanji and Chinese and stuff like that, so it actually made me also think a lot of Hong Kong, because I remember having been through there, there's parts of Hong Kong that looked a lot like what they were kind of portraying and everything for whatever reason. I don't know if they were just using that as a reference but it was more so that than what I remember of Tokyo stuff, because like Tokyo was a lot more polished, and also even like kind of the somewhat grimy parts and everything were the ones that supposedly were excuse me, along that lines. Like Shinjuku was like one of the areas that's supposed to be a little bit more like the Times Square, if you will, of Tokyo, but even that like kind of looked very polished.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember actually if do they actually say whether it is in Tokyo during the movie?
They never really say exactly, but it's almost implied, like like you said, in some ways and stuff. Yeah. I mean, you don't ever really know which city they're in, because it's never outright spoken, but all the names are Japanese, so it's kind of reasonable to assume, because otherwise they would use like Chinese names and stuff if it was Hong Kong stuff.
Yeah,
unless of course maybe they visit a future that like Japan just kept expanding, I guess, and took over.
You never know. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of exposition about sort of political wranglings that are going on at that time, and that was sort of quite interesting. I think when I watched it in '95, that all went totally over my head, and I had no idea, but I paid a little bit more attention to it, so maybe some of it absorbed this time. But it's this idea of, they have this kind of problem with an ambassador or someone who's come into and they're trying to sort of basically there's a sort of a problem with immigration, is what I kind of inferred from the beginning of the story, and they're trying to sort of control the 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 spread of this sort of hacker problem from one country to another. Almost, it seems like that seems to be the main sort of opening theme of how we get to the puppet master coming to pursue. And I've actually forgotten the protagonist's name. It's completely gone from me. I can't remember if you remember her name.
I guess she's just referred to as Major. I mean, that's just like
that's it, isn't it? That's why, because doesn't she have a name?
Yeah, they never really use her name too much. It's more her rank as used almost like a name.
Which is pretty interesting, because she's like a puppet herself. She's just performing a particular function within her remit there. So it almost seems like the way they portray this society. It's like the people with all the AI control of the police or the security forces of the country, and it's more or less an authoritarian kind of regime from the way I interpreted it. And they make a number of references to the fact that all the money is being poured into this sort of AI development, or this cyborg augmentation. It's pretty much under the control of the government, and that's it. It's very different kind of idea that we've let big tech companies run rampant, and they're the ones. They've reined all of that in, so that it's just a complete kind of government controlled initiative.
Definitely, like the lines are blurred between like company and then like kind of the government agency and stuff, like where the developments kind of like somehow just seem to be really enmeshed in like this agency that like to me it's like much more the police, because they're certainly not dealing with like parking tickets and stuff. It's more like almost like a I don't know, like a step above even FBI. It's kind of like more like a central, like a secret police is like kind of like a central intelligence kind of thing, because they have like these special ops, like kind of soldiers that like kind of will jump through ceilings and all that kind of stuff.
And they seem to be able to get their hands on incredibly heavy artillery at a given notice. But they do mention the one company that does make them, actually. I can't remember the name of it, but they say basically this one company makes all of the components, and they're the main contractor who does this. So but this idea that we're focused on a kind of a detective story was pretty interesting. Again, harkens back to Blade Runner. But I guess it allows you the ability to show different levels of the society as well, which is always kind of
definitely that's a great point. That's another way that it echoes Blade Runner, because one of the kind of proverbial mystery questions beyond like kind of the main one of like kind of Deckard trying to find replicants is like kind of this question of is Deckard himself a replicant, right? Where it's like kind of always left to be a little bit ambiguous, and I feel like there's a little bit of like where on the one hand we know that Major is a cyborg, but it's like kind of and of course that's one of the key central questions is like, okay, what is she really and stuff, like kind of I guess we don't need to spoil like kind of the idea of like kind of these memories that what it's and that's kind of like goes back to between both Blade Runner and even Westworld, like kind of what are the sources of the memories? Are they in fact real, or of course the big question is are they like implanted, I guess. I mean, in terms of her sort of general level of humanity, she's mostly expressionless for the whole movie. If you notice that. And also because she can communicate wirelessly with her team, we don't even see her talk a lot of the time, which is kind of weird, in that she seems quite lifeless except for her role of kind of violence and her sort of naked sort of it's a kind of a weird humanityless sort of sexual thing of her just being sort of a sort of a naked girl, but also
but with no real kind of human inside, or very little. That's the question, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it gets into discussions we've had about psychopaths, and also and sociopaths, in the sense of where on one hand, like we question, like, kind of, supposedly this is humanity, but we don't really get a sense of this kind of empathy in any way. And the other thing is that, like, something that's more related to sociopath is that a lot of sociopaths are risk takers because they really don't have this. They don't really feel this fear. Like, kind of we see a lot of that as well. Like that she's basically, like, kind of very capable of this violence, but with, like, like no real reactions. Kind of in these scenarios and stuff.
Yeah, and that's sort of part of what makes you. I mean, she has a moral code, but again, we call a moral, code. You wonder how much of that is actually sort of made for her, so to speak,
right.
And what actually constitutes her own real experience, which is, right. I'm sure a lot of people ask themselves that sometimes. But I mean, for me, one of the most intriguing ideas in this, and I think sort of speaks volumes for what's happened in the world since 1995, is when, you have the garbage man, who is essentially human, except for one sort of implant, basically has his memory and mind hacked by a computer.
Right.
Which is, I remember watching that originally and thinking, wow, that's really mind-blowing. I can't believe that, like, at some stage computers could just sort of completely warp our minds in a way. And, it really is indicative of social media bubbles and, the things that we're influenced by. It's admittedly far less direct, but it's sort of eerily prescient of what happens over the next sort of 20 years when you see elections being rigged by it and things like this. So definitely when we talk about the 2017 version, I feel like that's one of the areas that they really didn't capture because they had a different approach to it. We'll get into that, but I think that's one of that particular the garbage man segment is definitely one of the ones that really makes the original stand out by far. Yeah, definitely. I would say in terms of the differences, that and they really kind of gloss over the more kind of thought-provoking parts of the Puppet Master and Major's conversation at the end, where they're really sort of looking at this idea that the Puppet Master is an AI that's just evolved out of itself and is kind of self-contained and is trying to basically create, and I'm again, as normal, spoilers for getting into it now, but it's trying to create some new kind of life or new sort of branch of consciousness that can sort of exist in the world. Yeah, we didn't really get into that in 2017 too much, but it's definitely, I mean, it's not that, again, this is why I kind of like anime, is it can surprise you in something that you think is going to play out, and then you get a 5-minute kind of discussion about the nature of consciousness and what's real and what's not at the end of it. So, and a minute ago, you had a lady fighting a giant spider tank. So it's kind of it's interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea that humans can be hacked, and then something that is built to protect people from hacking is kind of hacked, but without any kind of direct contact. That's the other thing, is because he then states that the voices that she kind of hears while she's in the water or on the boat, but it's that sequence, are basically him communicating with her, if it's even a him,
Yeah.
Which is, starts to sort of make you question exactly how she is connected to whatever network she is, or is this sort of consciousness so pervasive that it kind of enters some sort of ethereal spiritual realm where computers have kind of managed to sort of communicate with us through other means, we'll say. So
one of the things I thought was also interesting is the fact that, like, she is physically attractive, and like she looks like this really, kind of like you said, sexualized, almost like the typical, female form, right, in comics and stuff like that. But like, not only, like kind of is she seem to have like kind of very emotionless kind of being stuff, but also like she's asexual in a lot of ways because there's no hint of any interest in anything else. And then also like I don't know. I feel like this one versus the 2017, like there's like this kind of relationship with the partner that is very not only kind of professional but very like kind of like just like it's not even tinged with like kind of any kind of real buddy as opposed to like kind of what they kind of get into a little bit with the remake and stuff.
Yeah, no, it feels more like a sort of a brother or sisterly relationship. If anything, there's a sort of protective nature that they hold over each other, where they don't want them either to get hurt. But there's no, like you said, no kind of romantic connection there at all, or even any kind of father-daughter kind of relationship. It feels very much kind of peer level, really.
I mean, so I'm wondering also then, like, is like her appearance then, strictly for like the fanboys that kind of like to make her more appealing, or is there like kind of something being stated with like kind of using this kind of idealized female form or something like that?
Yeah, no, I think it's quite a clever device, really. I mean, because on a surface level you can see like that, but in another level you can say that he's saying, what is it if there's no real humanity behind a particular form? What is it that we actually find attractive about it? And he tries to make her basically, aside from what she visually looks like, there's really nothing that kind of gives you any kind of normal behavioral cues of sort of feminine sexuality in a way.
Right.
If anything, she's complete opposite. She's there just beating the crap out of people, and it's a very sort of interesting sort of way of defining her character, I think.
Because like in other shows, the fact that because we were talking beforehand about Strange New Worlds and stuff, there's this one character that specifically in a certain kind of moment, she acts as this kind of helpless female beings. She's calling for help and stuff like that. And so that's actually what made me think about how like a lot of times we like there's almost like kind of this, besides stereotype, it's also this cue that we have as guys different times, right? If a female is kind of like in distress and asking for help and stuff like that, it's like this kind of like, it's almost like a trigger, if you will, and stuff like and everything. And here, like like I said, it's like almost a total opposite. Where like she's at cooking, she's like shooting and all this kind of stuff, and it's like kind of, I mean, it's not even used for any kind of deception, if you will, and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely that's not a that was the thing in the 90s, and it's obviously we're now very politically correct and we're doing this all the time. But there's normally at least some kind of other indication of some femininity, but she doesn't really have very much of that at all. But then again, she doesn't really have much humanity in general, really, to be honest. So it's that's what I think is more interesting, is that it kind of questions you as a fanboy. Is humanity even required for you to find this sort of visually appealing? It's
right.
And I mean, it's also kind of there's other sort of visual cues like the mannequins in the shops as she's passing by, and just like I'm sure she is kind of self-questioning, we're also questioning what is the difference in there. But it's it's definitely, it makes me sort of think about what has actually sort of transpired after that in terms of just sort of anime, and because it's kind of more and more, I find the visual aspects of anime and manga are being adopted by the West, but not necessarily, people don't necessarily watch the shows or anything like that. So you find people dressing up as anime characters or that kind of style.
Right.
But not necessarily, but but it makes you sort of wonder, like a lot of that also kind of they almost look like dolls that have been made real in a way. And, it makes you wonder sort of what is the appeal of this? Why is this a kind of a visual kind of trend that seems to be getting more? Why do people want to look like dolls more, I guess, is the question is that I ask myself. But yeah. So I guess in other parts of this, the other interesting thing that I thought comes up in this idea is this idea that there is prejudice against robots or automatons in this, and it's like, are you actually in control or not? So I mean, they don't really get into it, but there is this idea of a kind of will there be a kind of an AI robot consciousness or automaton backlash at some point, which is kind of, you see that in Star Wars as well. There's no droids allowed in here. So it's interesting they've got that. They think about that as a potential issue. I also sort of, this idea of a simulated reality is something that kind of obviously that on a deeper level is what the Wachowskis obviously picked up with and ran with in The Matrix. But there's a lot of that sort of bits where you question which characters are actually living in I mean, we know that the trash collecting guy is living in a completely simulated reality, but yet he's human, which is a really interesting idea. But then again, sort of, I mean, I often feel like sort of animation is a kind of a simulated reality. We actually are filling in a lot of the gaps as well, because it's not animation, so not live action. So that I think is quite an interesting, there's that along with the idea of how Major's portrayed are also quite sort of interesting things about anime, how it's perceived and how people sort of watch it. The other visual bit that I think is really interesting is this idea of the city portrayed as a network. If you notice, there's bits where it's kind of, we're seeing a network and the city itself is kind of zoomed in and out, and it's hard to tell which bits are the levels of the lines of communication and which bits are, the actual cityscape. Which, again, it kind of, this idea of how different are our computer networks from, again, our best effort to recreate our neural network as a city, and then our computer network as a city within our fabricated mind, if you will. So
definitely that reminds me of the discussions we had with Westworld, like kind of the blurring of like kind of things that are in software versus things that we in our everyday life kind of do and stuff like that. Like that different times our daily routines are like almost like these programs that we are kind of repeating and stuff.
I think that's probably where Westworld has the point that it makes more obviously and with a little more originality is the idea of living in loops. This does sort of question what is stuff that we've been programmed with and what is actually our own free will. But it doesn't sort of, it doesn't have time really, because it's just a 2-hour movie to go and do the same things again. But yeah, it's and the things that it really questions is and I think it's interesting that it's a detective story, because she's really on a journey to find out who she is, and we're kind of following along the detective story, and she's following the leads. But no, I mean, I don't know, that's maybe more in the remake. In this, it's really a detective story of trying to figure out what she can become, or what is left of what really constitutes her humanity, I think. And I think it's very interesting that she becomes a little girl at the end of it. It's really, as this new, she kind of she's born again, but I guess it kind of shows that it visually shows you that she's something new, because she's kind of melded with the puppet master. But it's and I think he says I think Batou says he just found this robot and they uses it as a kind of something to upload her into. But the fact that she actually looks like her, just but younger, is kind of interesting.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's like something that they don't really dive as much into, is this idea of like her being a younger girl, like kind of, like physically, until like the transformation or the changes that happen to her, something like that. They kind of will get into it more at the remake, that they kind of to maybe the detriment of the main story, like kind of get a little bit more to this subplot, I guess, if we will.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from an ethical standpoint, in whatever authoritarian society the anime lives in, there's really no problem with taking human brains and shoving them into robot bodies. It's like, that's fine. Yeah. There's no kind of they don't even. It's interesting that that's not even raised as a problem at that point in time. So clearly a very different moral landscape in that point in time. But yeah, and I guess then this is probably about as good a time as any as us to switch over to the 2017 remake.
I think so. So apparently, when Ghost in the Shell was released in the U.S., it originally had a R rating, and I thought that was kind of interesting because although it has like kind of violence and stuff, but I didn't really think of it as like kind of that violent. And the other thing was like nudity, and again, like I felt like the nudity was like of a with Barbie dolls, right? Where like there's really no genitalia, it's just kind of like this smooth surface and stuff.
Yeah. No, it was. I think there was a lot of what seemed to probably sell in the early 90s in terms of anime tend to be sort of stuff that was borderline hentai or stuff that was like ultra violence, mostly because that was so far removed, I think, from cartoons that we'd already had on TV and clearly defined it as something adult. Okay. So I think it kind of got lumped in with a lot of other releases at this time.
Got it.
But yeah, I remember as well, it didn't seem anywhere near severe enough to have got that rating.
Yeah.
I don't know that it got an 18 rating in the UK. It may have been more like a 15. I can't remember now, but
okay.
I'll have to check. But yeah, certainly more edgy than the Rupert Saunders directed 2017 version with Scarlett Johansson. Rupert Saunders only really directed 2 movies that I could really find. Snow White and the Huntsman and this, and lots of video shorts. Considering this is basically his second full feature-length movie, I suppose it's pretty good, I guess. It's a lot better than some other efforts we've watched, to be fair. I think, though, it doesn't, considering the source material, you probably could have got some a little bit more experienced and a little bit more money was thrown into that direction. But this was actually partly funded by the Shanghai Film Corporation, which was quite interesting. So I thought that was quite interesting, that it was obviously a sort of a US-Chinese co-production or something.
I thought it was one of the interesting, protests or whatever kind of was about racism and whitewashing and stuff. And my reaction to that is I really don't see like the original Major as Asian in any way. And then certainly I don't see a need that like, that there was a thing of where the shell, if you will, in this case, had to be Asian in any way either, or for that matter, I don't see it as Scarlett Johansson as portraying like an Asian character, like at a, or trying to be, Asian, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the Major is a brain. We don't really know where she's from at all.
Right.
I mean, part of that is as well, whether they kind of, I mean, it's I don't really like the turn that the story takes, but she is actually Japanese inside, and her brain is Japanese, but her body isn't, I guess, is one way of looking at it. So
But certainly we saw that in Westworld, right? Where, you know, like what was it even called? The little module that like they can basically put into any being. Like, so, you know, Clementine could just as easily be in like a, you know, this African American, you know, bodybuilder, you know, shell, if you will, as, you know, a little, you know, girl's body and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's just because the original story is Japanese, and they felt that should just be, and of course, you know, maybe because it's set in possibly Tokyo, Hong Kong, or somewhere like that. They felt, but yeah, I don't know. I don't
actually,
think
in this one, they actually did film in Hong Kong apparently as well,
right,
for some of the scenes. So yeah.
And it's interesting because, like you said, the cityscape in the original is obviously one that feels a bit more dirtier. It has some sort of environmental issues and things like this, and probably does look more like modern day Hong Kong, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it was an interesting idea. I have my main problem with it is not so much that she is not Asian; it's more that she's too human. They write the character of the Major as kind of like your typical kind of rogue, loose cannon detective, and she's kind of angry and things like this. But that takes away from the main point of it. The fact that the Major is so emotionally removed and so inhuman in a way, is that it gets you to sort of question more, you know, is she a machine or is she actually a human? There's really none of this. She just feels like a kind of a, you know, an angry, it's kind of like a revenge story, more or less, isn't it? To be honest with you.
But it's interesting that the anger that she portrays, though, is very much like kind of the same anger that we see for the Black Widow character, or even like in another similar film, Lucy, right, where it's like kind of that there's kind of like this cool kind of coolness to it that Scarlett Johansson just seems to be kind of, that's her natural state, if you will, that, like, you know, even when she's angry, it's kind of like this kind of I don't even know how to describe it other than that it's not like anger that we see with somebody who's like, you know, this kind of passionate kind of person, whatever and stuff.
Yeah, she's definitely got a kind of it's a cool kind of anger, like you said. It's
like even
subtle, I would say.
Even in Jojo Rabbit, where she plays this, you know, single mother and stuff, right? It's very similar. Like, kind of, there's something about Johansson, like when she does this kind of anger, it's like it's not ever like, you know, raging. It's kind of like just kind of like, you know, like
sort of seething.
Seething, yes, that's a great word.
You know who I would have loved to have seen play the Major in this instead would have been Brie Larson, because I felt like I actually feel like her role in Captain Marvel would have been she was so robotic in that she would have been perfect in this role. I think it's almost seamless. It would work perfectly. Anyway. Right. So I guess the other players we have in this, we've got I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but Pillow Asbach, who was Euron Greyjoy in Game of Thrones.
I was going to say, yeah.
His claim to fame. I mean, he's very good as Batou. I think given the script that he's given. Yeah. I think the effects for his eyes look a bit weird, to be honest with you, and it didn't really work. But we've got one of my favorite actors, Beat Takeshi Takano, as the head of the police, who's great in movies like Violent Cop and things like that. And an odd casting choice of Juliette Binoche as the sort of head scientist who's created the Major.
We've seen like in Godzilla in a very similar role, right? It's kind of like, you know,
exactly.
She seems to have this kind of typecasting now as kind of like when they want a foreign-speaking, you know, scientist, you know, female scientist.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, she seems intelligent enough to be a scientist, but also foreign and vaguely familiar from other older movies. I mean, this kind of they change a lot of the opening with this one, in that they have this intro blurb that basically just kind of tells you half of how the world works, just to make it really easy for the dumb people in the audience without you having to figure it out as you go along, like you would in the anime.
And to me, like, that was one of the worst uses of that space, because like you compare that intro, right, and where we're trying to like build up, kind of not only interest but also like kind of like kind of engaging stuff, and then you compare the intro of Up, like night and day, like kind of how much more engaging kind of is this between. I mean, granted, Up is a sentimental kind of story and stuff like that, but even then, like regardless of what you're trying to evoke, I think at least you want to like pull the audience to kind of care about the character, like because here's this kind of person who's going to be emotionless and hard for audiences to really empathize with already, and like you put this kind of black screen with text to like for us to like I don't know, to start enticing us to care about them.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like the original doesn't ask you to care about the Major. It's not treating its audience like idiots, basically. It's like
right.
It doesn't even try and spend its time getting you to identify really with the characters, because it's more just saying to you, this is a really interesting future world and these are the kind of things that might happen, so pay attention to that rather than trying to see if you really feel anything for this main character. And that, it feels like a really forced character arc they're trying to push on you that doesn't really suit it. And like you said, I mean, she's not supposed to have any kind of real human or very little kind of evoking any human emotion. So it's anyway, I'll stop ranting now. But it's also an amalgamation of both the second Ghost in the Shell anime and the first one, because they have the scene with the kind of the doll that is there at the business meeting or the political meeting, whatever it is, that goes rampant and they've got to try and hunt it down, this kind of thing. So bit of a kind of a visual nod to the second movie there.
Yes,
which I thought it was quite good, actually.
Yeah, certainly one of the things about, the remake that they do well is like they do have some pretty compelling visuals, like the doll and everything. I mean, that was definitely one of the most memorable parts of that one. I think the other kind of I don't know about sin, if you will, or kind of thing that like the remake kind of brings up, though, is this idea that different times I feel like with animes we have a certain expectation and we go into it like kind of like to expect a certain kind of look to the world and stuff like that. And with the live action, I feel like that one of the things that like even going back to again Blade Runner and stuff, is that like the audience has to, I think, like even like kind of if we're not trying to make them care or relate to the character, we at least to the world, I feel like has to have something that makes it where it's relatable, if that makes sense. Because certainly I feel like that's what Blade Runner right away achieves, even though like it has this dark and gritty world, but there's something about it that kind of feels like, okay, we can kind of see that like, that's how, LA in the future will look, or, like kind of that, like it's kind of like something we can connect to and stuff like that. So we can have some kind of grounding to what's going on. And I feel like with the remake, we really don't get that. We're just thrown into this world. And
yeah, we're kind of thrown into it. I mean, that's the thing. It doesn't really, it spends a little too long trying to recreate portions of the original anime scene for scene, but then just warps totally other bits of the story into a really bad, and well, in my opinion anyway, but it doesn't really explore the much of the sort of the technology that could be around in this future world. It doesn't feel like it does. I mean, I suppose it has the Doctor who's got like the fake eyes that she pulls off and things like this. So you can sort of see bits of it, but I don't know how to describe it. It feels like it's just it spends so much time trying to crowbar in the whole kind of lost brain of the immigrant that, you don't really get to explore the world as much as you'd like to, I feel, in the movie. And I would say the other main difference is that whilst we weren't really concerned with the ethics of how brains are put into robot bodies, this spends the entire movie kind of, that is the main sort of crux of it. And rather than the other main difference, I guess, is rather than the government being in control of all of the AI and cyborgs, is that it's now an evil corporation that's doing all of this and somehow abducting protesters who sort of go against the government and turning them into killer cyborgs. So there's this kind of idea that I guess in this future world, I mean, it's authoritarian, but perhaps in a different way. It's authoritarian in that it kidnaps and sort of mutilates its citizens and turns them into cyborgs. So which seems like a really, I mean, fundamentally, that's a really bad idea. You know, you get someone who doesn't like the government already, and then you're going to give them like a really expensive, powerful robot body. It seems like fundamentally not a very clever decision to make. True. Whereas they don't really have to face that problem in the original because they don't even, you know, we don't even know where the Major's from. So,
I mean, I think that's one of the major kind of flaws of the remake is, you know, logic like that, and then like the whole thing about asking for permission or like kind of consent and stuff like that, and so different times they ask for Major's consent to do different things to her and everything, and then for some reason the chief at the one point asked for consent to kill the villain or something like that, and like, do you remember that part? Like, kind of, I thought that was like kind of like what? Like, why is this kind of subordinate asking the chief, or why is the chief asking the subordinate for permission? You know.
Yeah, it didn't really make any sense, to be honest with you. I don't think you're alone there. I didn't really understand that. It's almost like, hey, you know, privacy is like a IT concern right now. Let's try and crowbar that in somewhere because this is kind of like about technology. And they just made the point that we don't need consent anyway. We'll just do whatever the hell we want because we're an evil corporation. Yeah. Weird. There was, I mean, you know, Beat Takeshi didn't really get a lot of time other than, you know, shooting people with a revolver a little bit, which is one scene he got that was kind of cool. But yeah, that so you know, Juliette Binoche is the kind of evil mother kind of character, I guess. And then it spins off into this weird love story between her and the puppet master, who in this is someone who's glitching to show that there's something wrong with them mentally, which is a very blunt sort of hammer approach to showing that people have problems, I guess.
Michael Pitt, by the way, like you know, the actor who plays, you know, kind of the this, you know,
glitchy boyfriend
and stuff. He's actually like one of the characters I actually really like enjoy or kind of like appreciate from Boardwalk Empire, and so he's kind of has this now this typecast of being like kind of this tragic, I guess, you know,
glitchy bad guy.
yeah, more or less.
Oh boy, yeah. Oh well. I mean, if it's working for him, then yeah. So so the heart of this conspiracy is that, you know, immigrants or protesters are being, you know, rounded up, having their brains cut out and put in robots. As you do, right? That's the easiest way to quell any uprising in a country is just to scoop people's brains out, clearly. So yeah, that obviously you can tell I wasn't terribly impressed by that plot turn. There's no real philosophical questioning of which part of her is human, which part is a computer, or which bit is augmented. We do kind of have the trash guy being hacked, but but it's done in a very kind of weirdly haphazard way, I would say, in this.
Like there's no real explanation for, or here's the thing, if anything, the problem is that like the moments that we get explanations, it's like kind of this dialogue, you know, like the opening credits and stuff, and the other times we're kind of just suddenly just thrown, I don't know, thrown at, or just given these things like we're you know, the garbage guy just suddenly has a weapon in his hand that like then he's you know, like this kind of rampaging, you know, kind of soldier or something like that, and it's like we there's no like kind of indication of like kind of that the reprogramming is going on. It's just something like something kind of some switch flipped apparently, and then suddenly he's like this, soldier for kind of the this puppet master and stuff.
Yeah, which wasn't the case with the original. He just basically he's because they don't really spend any time trying to actually track the puppet master as a kind of a piece of code that's moving from place to place. It's more just kind of, oh, there's something wrong and we don't know. We're trying to find out where. Well, I guess there is. They're trying to find out the location of the puppet master, but it's actually, he's actually a person or a cyborg, we'll say, rather than a kind of an AI consciousness that couldn't be found anyway, which is kind of what's appealing about the original, I would say. But yeah, I mean, it's I think what's interesting about the original is that you have this guy who's like a known felon and the trash guy, both of which have been kind of had their minds reprogrammed, so to speak. It becomes a little more interesting, I would say. But
we show in the original like that the programming is that he has this kind of memory of this family and like kind of shown like kind of that like, okay, like he's in this delusional world that like he's has is trying to get back together with his wife and child and stuff like that, and meanwhile he's actually living alone in an apartment, and there's none of that in this.
No, there isn't, is there? Yeah, absolutely. You just know that he's kind of been taken over for the violence, so to speak. Yeah, and it isn't really much. I mean, is it a kind of detective story? It feels more like a kind of a revenge movie than a. This feels more revengey than a detective story, so to speak. And I mean, basically, Juliette Binoche's role in this is just to explain everything as we go along, to sort of move the plot along in various points. It's like, we need something different to happen. Let's go and talk to Juliette Binoche for a bit, and she'll tell us where to go and get the next thing. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting in that it kind of does try to kind of have some of the same visual scenes, but as I say, it knits them together in a kind of a weird way.
And there's also like now we do have a kind of a weird sexualization, like kind of where it almost seems like there's this certain moments where Major is with like this other girl who I guess has this makeup that like then she asks her to like not wear the makeup. I think some kind of digital makeup or something like that.
Yeah.
Remember that? And it was kind of like where it almost hinted at that like she's maybe like has these kind of lesbian feelings or something. It almost seems like, again, like something that's like in vogue, right? Like where young girls are impressionable and like they should explore their lesbian kind of feelings or something like that.
I just find that stuff so crowbarred into things. It's like I watched like Monsters versus Mitchells or whatever it's called, and it's just like a lesbian scene. Let's just throw that in right at the end there. And this was just like randomly, let's just throw a lesbian scene right in the middle, but not really do anything with it, not explore it, or whether the fact.
And nothing real, no real plot reason to have it in there.
No. Yeah, and I mean, there's the scene where she go and meets with her mother, and that's kind of like she doesn't know if she recognizes her or not, and but it's kind of, I don't know, it's one of those things. It's like I suppose this one is more about, I guess, rather than questioning whether you are a human consciousness or not, it's more, do you trust your memories if you're being kind to this movie? And there's even a line which is very interesting where they talk about memory. It's interesting not because the movie's interesting, but because they have this line which is, our actions define us, not our memories.
Oh, right.
But that exact same line is delivered by Rachel to Bruce Wayne in Batman Begins. It's actually verbatim line, exactly the same thing, which I thought was really odd. So considering we just watched that like a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And of course, there's more odd kind of quirky similarities. There is a shootout in a nightclub, just for a change, I mean, I've now realized that like a shootout in a nightclub is just a really cheap way to get an action scene in a movie. That's basically it. It's dark. You don't need any natural lighting. You can just like pack people into a room and shoot it and stuff. So yeah, a very by the numbers nightclub shooting scene.
Yeah, it's almost like just if you have a template for a plot, right? It's like kind of okay, shoot out a nightclub scene, but insert here.
Insert there, yeah, lesbian scene, nightclub scene, you know, Lego filmmaking. Yeah, it's I think what I found odd about this was that in so what doesn't, again, this is like there's a few sort of logical problems that this movie faces. We've got the puppet master who's a master hacker, and yet he spends all this time hacking into people and human beings and stuff like this, but he can't hack into the company that made him just to find out, and that surely would have been a lot easier and quicker. And then we could have cut an hour off this movie. So it's like, again, it's one of those sort of weird things. You know, it's this kind of portrays virtualized experience in a kind of a different way, sort of a VR experience. It tackles this more so than the original, in that when, for some reason, when they're on their way to see the puppet master, he has all these human beings who are all kind of standing around with or kneeling with VR goggles on, almost like they're in some sort of religious kind of ceremony or something, which was it's kind of compelling image in a way, but I don't really understood what the logic or what the meaning of it was in terms of the movie. But it was quite an interesting image. I'll give him that.
I wonder if some of the stuff like that is kind of like even like another thing that remind me, like I think we mentioned Minority Report, and like when they're walking through the street, right, you see like kind of like what looks like AR you know, advertisements and everything, and I felt like it was like, you know, the fact that like, you know, it's a DreamWorks production and Steven Spielberg is involved, like, you know, if it was like either special effects people that were from, you know, kind of, you know, Minority Report, or just even if, you know, Spielberg, you know, kind of that's like his touch or whatever kind of thing.
Yeah. In a way, I kind of feel like Minority Report was almost a better version of Ghost in the Shell than this, you know, because just the structure of it was a bit more. Like, again, that's in a way it's a detective story about someone trying to find out a mystery, and it's set in the future, and we're, you know,
and even like that image, right, of like kind of these collective, you know, a network, I guess, of like kind of these minds and stuff. That was another thing from Minority Report.
Yeah, exactly. Just done in a slightly cheaper way. Yeah, I mean, I felt almost in a way that this, rather than being a detective story where you're sort of tackling philosophical elements, this almost became more like a generational kind of conflict, in that it felt like there were old kind of corrupt people who were dabbling with bodies and cyborgs, and they were like these young protesters who didn't like society, and because they're Gen Z, you know, the boomers took their brains out and stuck them in a robot. It felt more like that than something that was about questioning, you know,
interesting
consciousness. Yeah. What did you, in terms of enjoyment, which one did you enjoy or not enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, you really can't. It's definitely like, it's not even apples and oranges. It's more like melons versus I don't know, like celery or something like that, because it's so far removed. I mean, you know, the only thing kind of it just the name and just like kind of, you know, some, you know, basic elements of stuff is similar, but you know, it just, again, like kind of I guess for me what's surprising is that like the budgets and the you know, the acting and you know, the talent involved and stuff like that, and then yet like as a movie it's yeah, you know, it's you know, visually different times very stunning and stuff, but it's just, in terms of the story, in terms of engaging and stuff like that, it just, you know, you can't really compare to the original, because like the original, like you said, just so many more philosophical and so many more elements that like kind of make it where you're engaged. You kind of like go, oh well, that's an interesting question, or that's like kind of something that like is intriguing, and yet like here is this it's glossy, it looks great stuff, but it's again gets it's not even an MTV effect here. It's like I don't know, like in this case it's kind of something that like looks good like for a what's called preview trailer and stuff, but then like once you watch it, it's like kind of like what's going on.
I think it's kind of ironic that actually you talk about the MTV effect because this guy did lots of sort of video shorts and music videos. So yeah, I mean, for me, the problem with it is that you've dumbed it down so much. You could have just not decided not to have insulted your audience and just made a more faithful version of it and done it with a bit more kind of artistic integrity, and you would have not then alienated all the people who are fans of the anime,
right?
And you would have made maybe a more thought-provoking movie. I don't know. I mean, do you think if they'd given this to like someone like Christopher Nolan, he could have done something? Not that he would have done to do it. Whether he would have made something interesting from it.
I feel like what you have to have is somebody who's excuse me, a fan of the genre, anime or kind of like that world. Not necessarily even goes to the show, but that they appreciate anime and what it, the stories and the worlds that you can create with it and stuff. But then somebody who is, a really good visual storyteller, like kind of, which, in theory, like again, with DreamWorks involved and Steven Spielberg, is really surprising that like that this is what they end up with and everything. Like it just kind of, to me, again, visually it looks great, but then story wise, which I think different times, I feel like what Steven Spielberg really does well. And of course, looking at his body of work and everything, but I don't know, like, I guess maybe part of it is like now he's much more removed from these projects, and he's like, just maybe just he's probably not even signing checks because other people are doing it for him. That like then maybe like it's he only probably is so involved with some of these different projects.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think this is one of those. There are some stories that are basically, especially science fiction, they're about the future or have big ideas in them that don't actually need necessarily the best or most dramatic kind of plot arcs, because they're ideas. They're almost like a collection of ideas that are just kind of packaged in and have interesting counterpoints, something like Brave New World or even sort of Minority Report and things like this. The actual plot isn't really that important. It's more just exploring the world, that's more fun than actually seeing what happens to the main characters in it. And I kind of feel like you could have made a live action version that was just more like that. I mean, obviously Jonathan Nolan must be a fan of Ghost in the Shell because he's nicked one of the most obvious visual bits for Westworld. Right. So maybe not Christopher Nolan, they should give it to his brother and his wife and see what they've done did with it. But you kind of you've got basically Westworld is kind of explores all the same kind of territory as well anyway.
Definitely.
But So this was the first of our anime remakes. Next up, we're on to one of my favorites, and I'm sort of dragging John through the world of anime as we go. And it will be Death Note. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that as well. And then we'll kind of explore, other ones. Let's see, sort of the others that we talked about.
And we had Battle Angel Alita.
Okay, yes, definitely.
I'm keen to do Fist of the North Star because I just think that'd be funny. Maybe Attack on Titan, things like that. So
super. Yeah, so once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you next time.